Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth of our series of lectures on the topic of in an age of disinformation or untruths. These lectures are hosted by UCD Center for Ethics in Public Life and the American University of Armenia as part of the Horizon 2020 project, PERITIA, Policy, Expertise, and Trust in Action. The lectures are simultaneously translated into Armenian, and video recordings of both the English and Armenian versions will be available from our YouTube channels. Today's lecture is by Professor Heather Douglas, who will be introduced by my colleague and PERITIA member, Dr. Shane Bergin, a physicist who is now in the business of advocating for science in educational circles. These lectures, the first series of PERITIA public lectures, will end in 2 weeks' time with a lecture by Professor Dan Sperber of Institut Jean Nicot. Professor Dan Sperber was also one of the keynote speakers of a workshop organized by Gloria Origi of Institut Jean Nicot. We are very pleased to announce today that those additional lectures will also be broadcast on this channel on June 2nd and June 15th. The June 2nd lecture is by Dr. Mark Alfano of Macquarie University, and he will be talking about trust along networks, and it will be followed by a public lecture by Cristina Bicchieri, University of Pennsylvania, who will be talking about third-party punishment and compensation in trust games. You will all receive notifications of these additional lectures and the Zoom link to them in the course of next few days. I hope you will be able to join us for these additional lectures organized by PERITIA. Now I'll hand you to the convener of this session, Dr. Shane Bergin.
Thank you, Maria, and you're welcome, everyone, whether you're joining us for the first time or whether you have been to some of our previous lectures. You are very, very welcome. And I know we have people tuning in from the United States, from across Europe, and over as far east as our colleagues in Armenia, and everyone is welcome here today. So I'm sure that you'll agree that trust and truth in 2021 are incredibly contentious topics for science and democracy, and we've been exploring that in this lecture series so far. We've heard about conspiracy theories, we've heard about the basis of trust in science, we've heard about disinformation campaigns, and I suppose the questions still remain: what truth is, whom can we trust, or how should we trust? And today's lecture by Professor Heather Douglas is yet another very compelling title, Trustworthy Science Advice. And Professor Douglas is based at Michigan State University's Department of Philosophy. Her research focuses on the relationship between science and democracy, including the role of social and ethical values in science, the nature of scientists' responsibility in and for science, and science policy interfaces such as science advising, science funding, and my own area, science communication. She is interested in how citizens can and should interact with science, including the basis for citizens' trust in science. She has also worked on the nature of objectivity in science and how to weigh complex, non-convergent sets of evidence. Heather is the author of dozens of articles and essays, several edited collections, and her fantastic monograph, Science Policy and the Value-Free Ideal. It's a fantastic book. I think something that any scientist would enjoy reading, and particularly anyone who works in the science advice industry, be they communicators or working for think tanks or government agencies. We today will have the same format as before, in that Professor Douglas will give us her presentation, and after that we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. one of the great things about this lecture series has been the quality and number of questions that you, the viewers, have submitted, and I'm sure today will be no different. So please feel free through Heather's talk to use the questions and answers button at the bottom of your screen to submit your thoughts and your questions. As always, in order to help my lack of ability to multitask, I'd ask that you keep your questions as succinct as possible. The longer paragraphs are great, and I do find them very, very interesting to read after, but it's very hard to distill a question sometimes from them. So just a succinct question is much more likely to catch my eye, and I'll put it to Heather at the end of the presentation. And we have time to engage with lots of questions from you guys. So please do use that questions and answers button at the bottom. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Douglas and thank her again for joining us today for our lecture series. Over to you, Heather, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Shane, for that very generous introduction. And thanks to Maria and the PERITIA crew for organizing all this. And thanks to everyone else who's joining out there who I can't see because we're on Zoom. First, let me share my slides. This is de rigueur, getting the slides up and ready to go. Trustworthy science advice. This is a talk for non-experts, for people who are not scientists and who need to assess science advice in order to gauge its trustworthiness. So I'll focus on the perspective of the non-expert needing to assess this expertise, rather than the perspective of the scientific expert trying to ensure that their work is trustworthy. I just couldn't fit both perspectives into the same talk. My argument today starts from two general positions. First, I think science is our most reliable source for empirical knowledge. And and I also think that democracy is our best form of governance. So my project has always been how to get these two to work properly together. And part of that is how should scientific expertise be used in democratic governance? Science advice is central to good decision-making for our governance and our public policy practices, but it's always advisory. So what does that mean? How should we think about that? And further, when is a source of science advice going to be trustworthy? And I don't just mean trusted, but trustworthy, worthy of our trust. And part of that is also how can we keep science advice from being abused in a political system? So for today, I'm trying to frame all of this in the challenge of the grounding trust in science advice. So the grounding of expertise must provide good reasons to trust science advice. So it can't just be like, do we in fact trust it? But what are the good reasons for it? And those reasons have to give us methods for assessing scientific expertise that can be used by non-experts. Right? That's part of the challenge. Further, science advice is called for by the problems of the day and not whether scientists have come to a consensus by themselves for an issue. So we can't wait for closure of scientific debate for the formation of science advice. So this means scientific consensus should not be required for advice giving. Experts can disagree, and we don't have to force an agreement out of that. Still, we need to know what science advice we should trust. And then finally, in democracies, there are generally two audiences for science advice: the advisee, who might be a political leader or a political appointee, and the general public. And so we need to have science advice that is accountable to both of these audiences in some sense. So in general, we need an understanding of the grounds of trust in science advice that, one, does not depend on one having scientific expertise, two, does not depend upon the presence of scientific consensus, and three, that provides an understanding of the basis of trust that works for both advisees and the general public. That's what I'm going to aim to do today. So this might be ambitious, but I'm going to try. And the structure of the talk is as follows. We're going to start with the nature of scientific expertise. And then we're going to talk about scientific expert judgment, including social and ethical values that I'm going to argue are central to scientific judgment. And then this is going to raise the problem of democratic accountability for those values. I'm going to argue that there are ways to deal with this, and that further actually solves the problem of trust. And then I'm going to step back and try to talk generally about the grounds for trust in science advice and come to conclusions about this. So that's the outline. Here we go. First, we'll start with the nature of scientific expertise. So in my view, expertise is fluid judgment in the face of complexity. This is often within a particular domain that might be scientific or non-scientific, as we'll see, but it's usually developed within an expert community. Expertise develops from and within interaction with other experts. It is working with experts that one learns how to navigate the complexity, to ask the most incisive questions, to know which paths are likely to be productive for finding out more and which complexities can be set aside as likely irrelevant. It is within a community of experts that expert judgment is developed and honed. We are each experts in some domains and non-experts in many, many others, right? And that's part of the difficulty. Becoming an expert is time and labor intensive, given that this is what expertise is. This is why we cannot demand expertise for the ability to assess the trustworthiness of expert advice. Yet specialized knowledge and the expert advice based on it have become central to running our world well, especially as specialized knowledge has increased over the past two centuries. So we might ask, can we use the outcomes of expert judgment to ground trust? Can we use past track records of success to decide on whom to trust this time? So we can answer this question through thinking about a spectrum of expertise and its ability to be assessed through measures of success. So here we have a spectrum from clear success to success with caveats to success being murky. Clear success is easy to assess in some cases. And these the markers of success in these cases shows that those experts are in fact the ones to trust, or the ones to believe in, or the ones that we think are the best experts. These forms, unfortunately, are usually in games. So chess masters and other expert game players are the easiest to assess. Those who win against other masters are the best experts. But games are simplifications of the real world with clear fixed goals and simplified rules. For experts in the real world, where we don't have such simplified rules, where goals are actually part of what's contentious in our society, we're going to need a more sophisticated approach. Some experts can still be addressed at least partially by short-term success in their advice, and that's success with caveats. And these are experts functioning in the real world. So, does the mechanic fix your car? Does a campaign strategist produce campaign victories? Does the doctor help make you healthier? Some failures by such experts does not mean they are not reliable. We can tolerate some failure because those experts may have needed more information than it was initially available, or a shift in strategy, and good experts will shift their approach in the face of lackluster results. We wouldn't trust a car mechanic who keeps doing the same thing over and over and still the car doesn't run properly. So repeated failure does undermine expertise. But then there's the success murky category. And for these experts, we cannot wait for clear measures of success or failure before deciding whether to take their advice or even to try out their expert advice provisionally to see how it goes. Timeframes for their work are too long. They deal with timescales that are outside the bounds of when we need to make decisions. Think of climate change as a particular example here. Or there are too many confounders that cannot be controlled for readily because human society or the environmental systems that they work with are too complicated for short-term measures of success to mean very much. Further, we very often want to apply expertise like this in new situations where past predicted success may or may not mean much. These are the most challenging forms of expertise to assess. And these are the ones that are often at the center of debates over which scientific experts and which science advice to trust. It is the remainder of the talk, I'm going to be focusing on this kind of expertise and science advice, because this is where the problems are. So if expertise is honed fluid judgment in the face of complexity, How should non-experts evaluate such judgment? I've just argued that in many of the most important cases for public policy, for democratic decision-making, we cannot depend on simple measures of past success. And with a greater awareness of the complexity of expert judgment, it seems we are even further from being able to find grounds for trust in science advice. But a deeper examination of how expert judgment develops and the nature of expert judgment will actually help assess our quandary and address it. So, as already noted, expert judgment develops within expert communities. For good expert judgment to be honed within such a community, the community needs to be well-functioning and to be structured in such a way that reliable knowledge is produced by that community. Social epistemologists have examined and debated these conditions for good knowledge production within communities, especially since Helen Longino's 1990 book, Science and Social Knowledge, came out 30 years ago. And they have noted some general characteristics that expert communities should have, including such things like locations for debate, criticism, and discussions. These locations include conferences where there are fora that are sort of encouraging for debate, talks like this one where you're going to ask me questions and I have to give them answers after the talk. Journals that have not just publications that are peer-reviewed, but also letters and discussions about the publications. Online fora that are hopefully well moderated so that you can't just have trolling taking over, but that encourage debate and discussion, and generalized peer review norms about what counts as good peer review, that it be constructive and critical at the same time. And you want a culture that takes seriously critical debate. There should be an expectation for both raising and responding to criticism. Note that criticism can come from within and from outside the community, which that got cut off there by my little graphic. Now, this means that it doesn't have to be just someone inside the community raising criticism. And criticism that it gets raised out from outside the community needs to be addressed by the community as well. But not everyone needs to respond to every criticism. So just because one person gets criticized doesn't mean they have to respond to it. If that were the case, then every senior prominent person would spend the rest of their career just responding to criticism, which is not what we usually want them to be doing. But every criticism does need to be responded to. There has to be somebody that steps up and responds to a criticism, even if it comes from outside the community. These are things that the public should look for when assessing expertise. We don't, as members of the public, need to track every detailed argument, every criticism raised and response provided back and forth. But that there is criticism and response is a sign of the reliability of expertise honed in this context. If, on the other hand, you have overwhelming uniformity of opinion within an expert community and a complete lack of response to criticism raised from both within and from outside the community, you should worry about the reliability of expertise developed within that community. It's not doing the social epistemological functioning properly. That robust and reliable expert communities seem to endlessly debate every detail. It can be frustrating to outsiders. I mean, when are they going to come to an agreement? But rather than seeing such debate as evidence that experts don't yet know anything, we should see such debate as the precondition for producing reliable advice. That's what we want to see in our expert communities. In addition, we want expert communities to have open doors to all who want to join the community and to have encouraged through those open doors a robust diversity of participants. So why is that important? Part of what makes an expert community trustworthy is having people from all different backgrounds and life experiences, different cultures and different starting points join the community. Such difference is a resource for recognizing and questioning assumptions, which is part of the critical discussion that needs to happen, and for generating new approaches, which is going to be part of the churn that produces reliable knowledge. This diversity includes a diversity of values held by experts, including different social and ethical values. I need a drink. So, why are such values held by experts important? Philosophy of science for the past decade has increasingly recognized that social ethical values are crucial for a range of judgments that must be made in order to conduct and conclude scientific research. For our purposes today, I will focus on two of the most important locations for values in scientific expert judgment. The first is in the framing of problems, or where scientists direct their efforts, what kinds of questions they get raised, what kinds of hypotheses get considered, and is the framing of the problem apt for the general problems that you might need for advice. And then there is the assessment of evidential sufficiency. What counts as sufficient evidence for supporting any given claim? How much uncertainty are we willing to accept? And which errors are going to be more important to avoid? False positives or false negatives? Down here you can see a range of books, including my own, that have addressed these concerns. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to look at any one of these for further examining these issues. The question of sufficient evidence is particularly explored in the Exploring Inductive Risk volume, which has a range of chapters that look at this issue, where inductive risk worries about sufficiency of evidence or sufficiency of methodologies or sufficiency of language considerations. Okay, so let's think about these two locations. Framings in advice is crucial, and the framing of any given problem for advice is very important. On what is advice needed? Often elected officials frame the problem for science advisors. Yet even if an elected official asks for advice on a particular question and thus frames it, what gets included or excluded in the assessment producing the advice is still a matter of crucial expert judgment, and one that should often be influenced by values and knowledge of the experts asked. So, for example, in the early 1970s, when Richard Nixon was trying to decide on whether or not the supersonic transport was as a form of commercial aviation was viable, he asked for advice from 5 different sources, committees within the federal government, including the Presidential Science Advisory Committee as one of them, for advice on the technical feasibility of the supersonic transport system. Some of those committees decided to interpret the technical feasibility as narrowly. Could you get a plane that could fly at supersonic speeds, be a commercial airliner? And those generally found yes. But there was also this issue of the tolerability of the sonic boom. And so some interpret it as, could you actually create baffles for sonic booms coming off these kinds of aircraft? And would that be technically feasible? And some of those also answered yes. But if you also included not just could you make such a plane, could it actually damp down the sonic boom, and could those additional technologies that need to damp the sonic boom, which add weight to an aircraft, then include the economic viability of these kinds of planes? When the frame was put in that framing, the answer was no. So the details of what is relevant and what is not is going to be part of expert judgment, even if the frame is somewhat given by an elected official, like a president. Further, if advice is asked for in a way that attempts to exclude what experts see as crucial to an issue, they should still challenge that official framing as inadequate explicitly and include the information in their assessment. To simply follow the framing of the elected officials would be to set aside their expertise, to bend science to fit the desires of the politician, and to fail to meet their obligations to the scientific community, to include relevant information, and to the public, which includes an obligation to provide complete and helpful advice. This is part of what happened with the Understanding Risk volume, which was initially tasked with giving advice on the process of risk characterization, which was thought of as a process in between risk assessment and risk management. But as they looked at this area of risk characterization, they realized that risk characterization was in fact encompassing of the entire risk assessment and including some of the risk management process. So it went from being this little sliver of activity in between these two stages to encompassing a big part of both stages. And that was overturning, in many ways, the initial framing of the advice asked. So note that an assessment of enforcement is not just an assessment of whether information is relevant, but also a value judgment about what is important. So social and ethical values of the experts are central to the framing of the advice, even when they're given a frame by elected officials, and central thus to the trustworthiness of the advice. The second location for values is in evidential sufficiency judgments. This is also crucial for science advising. Experts serving an advisory function do not just gather evidence and then list all the relevant evidence. Such gathering and listing would be completely insufficient for the function of giving advice. The advisee, whether an elected official or a member of the general public, needs to know what all the evidence means. What does it say, or what are the range of things that it might say? The expert advisor must make a judgment about whether the evidence is sufficient for any given claim. And as I and many others have argued, to make the judgment properly, the expert must include an assessment of the acceptability of error, what has been called inductive risk. And this assessment must include weighings of the social and ethical impacts of making particular kinds of error. If the expert waits too long, waiting for evidence to get very strong before making a claim, who or what will be harmed? If experts speak too soon, making a claim even provisionally, before the evidence is stronger, who or what will be harmed? Values assess the risks of error and the acceptability of those risks and set evidential sufficiency standards, even for claims with probability hedges. Now, it's important when recognizing this role for values in science to recognize that social and ethical values do not then determine the claims made. Evidential and knowledge-based considerations constrain this judgment enormously. Experts cannot and usually do not use the possibility of error to say whatever they want. If an expert begins to base their advice solely on their values, they're usually called to account by their expert community as making unfounded or unsupported claims. Demands for evidence are a check on expert practice, but it is not the case that standards of evidential sufficiency are fixed or universal. Experts disagree about how much evidence is enough to support a claim, even claims with probability statements. And this disagreement is often driven by disagreement about what kind of error, speaking too soon, speaking too late, is worrisome in a particular case. We can see this in the case of the debate of hydroxychloroquine back, if you go like over a year ago, back in March and April, when we did not yet have really strong evidence about whether hydroxychloroquine could be a potential treatment, a successful treatment for COVID-19. There was initial preliminary studies, very small samples, seemed to be successful. Is that enough for saying that hydroxychloroquine might be a plausible treatment, for saying that we should start using it as treatment? Or should we wait for more evidence, given that hydroxychloroquine also has risks of its own? And we don't want people thinking, oh, well, we've solved this problem too soon. There are risks of error in either direction. And depending upon the values of the expert making the decision to go with a piece of advice to make a particular claim, they're going to say something either sooner or later. In order to have, and this disagreement about, whether to say something sooner or later, this is a really important source of disagreement in expert communities. In fact, this kind of disagreement can drive robust discussion about evidential sufficiency within science. It can be helpful to have scientists with a range of value commitments in the expert community to raise criticisms and drive discussion. But then how should this value-ladenness of advice work in democracies? So it seems I have made the challenge of grounding trust in science advice worse yet again. If science advice is not, cannot be, even should not be value-free, then the problem of democratic accountability comes roaring forward. Value disputes are central to our political debates over how to live together with shared governance, and this means values can drive different assessments of science advice. So, I think it is better to recognize this as a legitimate source of disagreement than to pretend it does not or should not exist. Science advice should not be thought of as something outside of social and ethical concerns, as something that arrives in a hermetically sealed bubble outside of our political and ethical entanglements. The ideal science advisor is not independent of our society or the social. Value freedom is not a good ground for trust in science advice. Instead, shared values become one of the key bases for trust. Experts who make judgments as we would if we had their expertise are precisely those, and if we would be held accountable to the expert community of which they're a part, are precisely those we should trust. Science advisees trust their science advisors in part because of commensurate concerns. This is true whether one is considering an individual science advisor for a particular elected official or a committee developing a science advice as an advisory committee. So let's consider each of those sort of advising systems briefly. For science advisors, individual science advisors, these are often chief science advisors. The advisory relationship should be based on personal rapport, which must include trust and some shared values. Science advisors need not agree with all the values of their advisees, but they need to know what is shared and what is not. Further, they need to be clear with their advisees which values are central to their advice, so their advice can be used properly. If a piece of advice is framed by concerns not shared by the advisee or avoids errors that are not of concern to the advisee, then the advice, if taken on board, will actually not be good advice for the advisee. It will not help them reach their goals and balance their concerns. Science advice to be good advice has to be both empirically accurate and value-apt. And so when communicating advice, there needs to be clear framing, needs to be clear with the crucial evidence and uncertainties and the values. And then when the advice gets received by the advisee, the advice need not be taken. It could be rejected for sort of value concerns or additional uncertainty concerns or overriding policy concerns that sort of come from outside the advice consideration. But it's crucial that the advice not be distorted by the advisee. The advisor should not say the advice is one thing when it actually is something else, which is actually what Nixon did with one of his pieces of science advice on the supersonic transport. He claimed that the science advising committee that claimed that it was that told him that it was not going to be viable if you include the economic considerations. He claimed that they said the exact opposite. And that was one of the reasons why the US Congress passed the Federal Advisory Committee Act, requiring that advisory bodies generally make their advice public. If the advice gets distorted by the advisee, the advisor must go public because they have a responsibility to the democratic public to let them know that the advisee actually distorted their science advice. This is absolutely a crucial obligation. Now, for advising committees, ideally, they need to have both a proper range of disciplinary perspectives needed for the particular problem at hand to tackle the topic, and to have a good range of value perspectives represented on the committee so that you have a full airing of potential value considerations and to make the advice more trustworthy. This should help make sure disagreements about framing and evidential sufficiency assessment are properly aired and debated. All the members must also be able to give and receive criticism well. They have to be well-functioning members of expert communities. Statements of dissent should be provided, so you shouldn't mandate consensus because that is unhelpful for the advising process. If you don't reach an unanimous decision, then go ahead and make those statements of dissent public. Advising reports should, like individual advice, make clear both the evidential reasons and value judgments central to the framing of the advice and to the drawing of conclusions, and making clear the disagreements and values. Now, to apply this particular case, in 2019, the Union of Concerned Scientists raised concern over the changing makeup of this EPA Science Advisory Board. As shown on these two graphs, it went from an advisory board that was dominated by university scientists with some smattering of other organizations to one that became to be split between consulting and industry, which usually had very strong interests in particular cases, universities, and a little bit of government and non-NGO organizations. The Union of Concerned Scientists framed this change as being problematic because of a loss of independence of science advice. In my analysis, that's not the right criticism to make. What instead we should criticize is the potentiality for putting people on the board who aren't well-functioning experts, who perhaps have conflicts of interest that are so strong that they are not going to be able to take up criticism and respond to debates well. And notice the further shrinking of an already small segment of NGO representation. This is going to be really important for representing a range of values in civil society. Further, the university scientists should be selected to have an array of value commitments as well, to counterbalance what are going to be very strong value commitments, usually by consulting and industry. So it's rather an imbalance of value commitments instead of independence that is the key concern in this reshuffling of the EPA Science Advisory Body in 2019. Now, by making value judgments in science advice explicit, they can become part of the apparatus of democratic accountability. We, as members of the public, can assess our elected officials' responses to science advice better with values being explicit. So we can assess if science advice, if elected officials have distorted advice, especially if that advice is made public, and if advisors come forward and say, my advice was distorted. We can call out elected officials for hiding advice and yet using it for justifying decisions, especially when the advice doesn't actually match up with what their justification is. We can applaud elected officials for rejecting advice for good reasons, for example, for value misalignment or for overriding policy considerations. And we can also applaud them for acting on advice when there is value alignment and when they find the expert committee has functioned well. Further, we can assess science advisory systems for having a proper range of values and for having well-functioning experts on them. And when we need to make an assessment of who to trust, we can assess scientists in terms of partly whether or not we have values shared with them. So in sum, science advice should make clear the values central to the judgments that framed and concluded the science advice. What was considered relevant and important, what was not and why, what was considered sufficiently well supported, what was not and why. Making such judgments clear engenders rather than undermines trust. Shared values are a ground for trust. If an expert shows they care about what we care about, they're experts side to a well-functioning community, they are the experts to trust. They make judgments as we would have if we had their expertise, and thus they are deserving of our trust. Okay, so last section. Thinking of trust in science advice as dependent in part on values can be disturbing. In an era of rife misinformation, as previous talks have pointed out, of deliberate attempts to deceive the public, of echo chambers on social media, of so much bullshit, it seems that this analysis could just give cover to those who want to pick supposed experts who merely tell them what they want to hear. Wouldn't confirmation bias combined with value explicit science advice make our current situation worse? That is, haven't I just made it worse again? Here are some reasons why I don't think this is actually the case. First, we already have a big problem with confirmation bias and politicians picking experts that tell them what they want to hear, or members of the public just picking experts that just tell them what they want to hear. I think acknowledging the importance of values in science advice is really unlikely to make this any worse than it already is. But even more important, acknowledging the role for values can actually help make it clearer why people disagree and can reduce disagreement going forward. And this is because acknowledging the role for values can help find paths forward. We can ask when people disagree with, say, an expert we trust, why? Was it that the framing of the research or advice was inadequate? Would a particular reframing bridge distrust if that was included? If there was a problem of evidential sufficiency for a claim, what evidence would actually be sufficient? And instead of just yelling at each other, these are pathways forward to attempt to ameliorate ongoing disagreement. Further, with an acknowledgement that science advice is properly rich with values, politicians cannot hide political decisions behind the cover of value-free science advice. They can't say the science made them do it. They have to own up their own political agency in decisions. And further, there are lots of broadly shared values across political boundaries. Concern for human life, concern for justice, concern for economic opportunity, concern for the welfare of children and grandchildren. These are broadly held values, and they can create bridges across these echo chambers potentially. Finally, note that my analysis is not just about shared values. Values alone are not sufficient for trustworthiness. There is this importance of the expert community, of offering and responding to criticisms. We should not just trust so-called experts that are not part of such communities, that are not active in them. And these communities hold experts accountable, as they should, when they start to say things just because that is what a politician or members of the public want to hear. So we need to have well-functioning expert communities that, to reiterate, they have to be diverse, open, and criticism responsive. Those provide grounds for the development expertise, and we should draw advisors from those expert communities. And we should expect those expert communities to hold expert advisors and expert advisory committees and public officials accountable for missteps, for inaccurate statements, for failures to consider key evidence, for misuses of methodology or misuses of claims. We also can have an acknowledgement of the divergences based on values to help make our debate better. So where are we? Do we have grounds for trustworthiness of science advice that we can use to assess scientific expertise without becoming experts ourselves? I think the answer is yes. It's not as easy as just checking credentials, checking whether or not someone has letters after their name, but you don't need your own advanced degree. So here are some markers for trust and distrust. We should trust experts who interact critically with an expert community, who change their minds in response to new evidence and arguments, who are clear about what they think and the value judgments informing their judgments, and who make their advice available to the public. We should distrust experts with no critical engagement with other experts, experts who are always unmoved by new evidence and arguments, experts who do not explain why they think what they think or pretend like what they do is fully value-free all the time and keep their advice secret. So in finding trustworthy advice, I'm arguing that we should look for advice that is developed by experts, engaged with well-functioning expert communities that are open to critique, that foster critique and debate, and responsive to criticism, and are properly diverse and informed by the values that you share. Whoops. I'm sorry about that, too soon. What this does mean in practice is that when there remains real expert disagreement, when values are central to dispute about science advice, either through framing issues, evidential sufficiency issues, or both, and those values really do drive disagreement, the public might legitimately and reasonably disagree about which science advice to trust. Trustworthy science advice should not be viewed as a necessarily univocal source of information. We could have legitimate differences about which science advice is more trustworthy for our politicians and within the public. This means that when expert disagreement is ongoing, politicians should not and cannot use science advice as cover for their decisions regarding policy. As I said, that science made me do it is never a legitimate excuse. Politicians should own the fact that they must assess science advice for trustworthiness, that part of that assessment is based on values and part is based on an assessment of the functioning of the expert community, and that they are endorsing both the values and the soundness of the expert community in accepting advice. They are making a decision about which advice is trustworthy and then making a decision about what to do about that advice. They should be held democratically accountable for those decisions by the public. And this leads to my final point about the value of scientific consensus. Astute observers of this talk from the very beginning of the talk will note that consensus has not played a central role. I set it aside at the beginning. That is partly because I don't think that we should wait for scientific consensus to form before depending on science advice for our decisions, and partly because I do not want to incentivize scientific consensus blocking as a mode of delaying needed public policy. I don't want to incentivize merchants of doubt sort of activity. But what is the value of scientific consensus to science advice? So first, I think we have to recognize it must be properly informed consensus. Only a properly conformed consensus is valuable. So the expert community, the consensus must be formed out of a well-functioning community as described above, with a rich diversity of participants. A properly formed consensus is one that develops after a robust debate on the range of plausible interpretations of the available evidence, including the pursuit of new lines of inquiry that develop from the debate. A consensus has thus already taken into account a range of value positions relevant to the debate. And so we should think of advice based on such a consensus, not as value-free, but rather as responsive to a plurality of values. And it is thus broadly trustworthy by the general public. So in short, we don't need to wait for that consensus to arise to have trustworthy advice. Non-experts, I think, can assess the trustworthiness of science advice. Advice needs to come from trustworthy expert communities that have debate and criticism and diversity and openness. Advice needs to reflect shared values. Prior to consensus, trust experts which share your values. With a properly formed consensus, trust the consensus. Assessing these things is harder than looking up degrees and prizes, but I think we have access to such debates and such value considerations through particularly good science journalism. Trustworthy science advice, thus, we don't have to wait for expert communities to get to consensus. Trustworthy science advice can be achieved before that, based on the proper functioning of the expert community and shared values. And for that, I'm finally done. Oh, that was a little too long. Sorry about that.
No, it was great, Heather. Thank you so much. Lots of great comments from people as you were going. We really are very fortunate that the European Union has sponsored this whole endeavor at this time. It's like it had great foresight in knowing what calamity was ahead of us, and that talks like yours today are so applicable to the world we live in. And I could see echoes in your talk of various other perhaps political forces that were acting on you and others in the United States in recent years that may have informed some of your thinking. Actually, maybe that's a good place to start. Matt Carlson, one of our viewers on YouTube, said he wondered about the shared values in the advisor-advisee relationship. It does seem important, but you also have to look at the source of the problem. For example, doesn't adding more industry voices to the Environmental Protection Agency lead to more shared values between the advisors and the political administration who are taking their advice? Yeah.
So, I mean, this is, if you're picking the advisor solely on the basis of shared values, that's a problem. They have to also be embedded in a good functioning expert community, and themselves, if they're going to be on a committee, responsive to criticism, open to changing their mind, open to arguments. Right now, so I think one of the concerns about stacking committees with industry and consultants who are paid to very often provide advice to industry is that if you have your sole source of income from an industry that's going to be evaluated, it's really hard not to have an overriding conflict of interest that makes the values then override the existing evidence. And that's a big mistake, right? Values shouldn't override the existing evidence. They should only weigh the problems of uncertainty and get involved in, what's actually relevant. And that's why you have to have both advisors who are responsive to evidence and critique, to make sure they have that kind of underlying intellectual integrity, but also why you want a range of values on that committee so that none of the voices override each other. Right. It's really important. And I'm really worried about the small size of the NGO pool on there. Right. It's like, why is that part of civil society so minimized? That's not good.
Yeah, it's a graph of power breakdown in most democratic societies, It kind of links, and maybe you've answered this in part, to a question from Joe McDonough, who says, great talk, and he thanks you for your contribution today. He said the expert community idea is reminiscent of Lave and Wegener's community of practice concept, which is quite trendy now, I think. Something I've used in my own public engagement research. And Joe asks, what if an expert community rejects certain ideas or people by virtue of their background, example, politics or gender? He notes that psephologists in Britain have suggested that election predictions are often wrong because they undersample, for example, ill-educated white working class men. Reflexivity, he suggests, within the expert community is thus very important. And I guess that does connect to what you were saying in your previous response.
Yeah, and that's why, expert communities that exclude people based on backgrounds or exclude people based on, sort of theoretical commitments, even going in, as a matter of principle, it's worrisome because you want that community to be able to engage fully with all kinds of ideas. That's part of what makes scientific knowledge robust. Merton said this way back in 1942, and it's, even more true today. I think today we have to worry about even more active recruitment of diverse voices to scientific communities, not just open doors, but like being genuinely welcoming. So you keep that diversity up. And I think paying attention to those diversity deficits is really important for engendering trust as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Reminds me of Naomi Oreskes in the first lecture of our series, where she talked about the epistemic strength of diversity. I guess there's great epistemic strength in any community, and the more diverse it is, the better. Matthew Shields has another question and says, in what way should scientists make their values explicit in their papers, in separate statements, or in other ways? And how should these statements of value be evaluated? Presumably it's a problem if scientists haven't thought critically about the values they endorse. I think that last bit's very interesting. Are scientists actually aware of the values that they hold?
So this is actually one of the big challenges. I think there are two big challenges. One is in how we do science education for school kids, but let's leave that aside for now. One of the other big challenges is helping scientists get more comfortable and more aware of the value judgments in their work. When I wrote my dissertation, over 20 years ago, one of the things I was doing was trying to figure out why there was expert disagreement about dioxin. And so I was reading a ton of scientific studies. And it was only by reading a ton of scientific studies that I began to realize that scientists were telling me what their values were in their opening statements and in the conclusions of their studies. When they said, I'm really worried about underregulation of chemicals, that was telling me something about their values. When they said they were really worried about premature overregulation of industry, that was telling me something about their values. They were sort of sneaking it in as opposed to being explicit about it because they were supposed to be value-free. And when I went to Society for Risk Analysis meetings, starting in the late 1990s, I saw the same sort of thing happening. The scientists knew that they weren't supposed to talk about values, but they kept coming up in like how they frame things and how they assess the strength of evidence. So part of what my work is trying to do is to make them more realize that it's not a violation of norms to talk about values that inform their work, that it is in fact a necessary part of their work. How to train scientists so what they write the papers, they do this better is a really deep problem for graduate school cultures. And I think part of it is sort of ameliorated currently by really good science journalism. So I've been really heartened by the way in which science journalists have gotten a lot better at unpacking debate among experts in pieces on science, sort of long form. Maybe I think Undark is one of my favorite places for this kind of journalism, where they really get into the disagreements. They end up, scientists express their value commitments to the journalists, and the journalists then tell the public, right? So there is this kind of workaround, but it would be really great if in papers, scientists were clearer about, I pursued this problem because, now this means eschewing the passive voice. We pursued this problem because we cared about X, right? We decided this evidence was sufficient because we were really worried about this kind of error for these reasons, right? And that's a change of how practice would go.
Well, one of my friends who's a journalist says the way scientists write, he says you're doing your best to make this as incomprehensible as possible to a non-scientist reader. So I think moving away from that passivity is perhaps to be welcomed. It's very freeing to write in the first or third person. It's great, but I have a follow-up on that. Like, I wonder, we think of some scientists, maybe more in the social scientists end of things at times, where the values are very explicit, and often positionality statements are included. Like, can it go too far? In other words, could you imagine people are going to come up with the results that they were always going to come up with because their values were going to bring them down that line anyway?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm very interested in standpoint theory, which is partly about positionality. But one of the things that standpoint theory says is positionality isn't sufficient. Like, just because you have a position doesn't mean like your voice is automatically better. Standpoint requires deep reflection and reflexivity on the nature of that position. So I would be less inclined towards statements about positionality than statements about starting points, presumptions, concerns, drivers. Those are much more interesting to me, and I think more relevant for the public's ability to assess expertise for its trustworthiness.
Yeah, I think in your book you make a very good, and maybe I picked this up wrong, but you make a very good distinction between those direct drivers and the indirect ones. And once the scientist is committed, they really need to try and exclude the direct values and sort of let the game play out, according to the rules of the experiment. Antoinette Fage Butler has a kind of an add-on question here, and says, again, great that you focus on making explicit the values in scientific advice. Can you say more about the public's values? How to manage the communication between scientific experts and the public, given there are values on both sides?
Very much so. So I think it's really important for experts to recognize that their values are not probably the same as all of the values, all of the values of all the public. The public is diverse. The public is complex. And it's perfectly acceptable for a member of the public to say, I think you are a good expert in the sense that you do your work well and you're responsive to criticism and you've done your work carefully, but you haven't spoken to my concerns. The way in which you frame the problem isn't about what I'm concerned about. And so your advice isn't helpful to me. That is a perfectly legitimate move for a member of the public to make. And the advisor should, a science advisor should make their values explicit so that members of the public can know when the advice is speaking to them or not. Right? That's really important. So, one thing you should not do as an advisor is try to deceive the public about what the values are. Right? To make sort of a claim like, and all the values are included in my analysis. Right? I mean, this is what a consensus, a well-formed consensus from a diverse community should eventually do. You can say all the values have been considered. But for an individual expert to make that claim, that's probably overblowing it a little bit. And so be clear about your values, and then don't be offended if someone says, okay, that was very nice, but you didn't speak to my concerns.
Yeah. It sounds so simple. It must be true. It's a great argument. We've another question from Anirban, and Arinaban asks, how does one deal with views coming from alternative expert paradigms? That's a great one, right? I share the house here with hermeneutic phenomenologist, philosopher like yourself, who tells me as a physicist, you guys think you kind of have a view on everything, but maybe it's not the only view. So what would you say? Suppose you're answering the question that might come from my own home here, as well as from Anariban. How do we deal with views coming from alternative expert paradigms?
So first, is it actually, do you mean like they have a different starting point, worldview, or do they have like a different sense of what expertise is? Because if you move to the meta level of like a different sense of what expertise is, and you have sort of like an expert is one who has direct access to the truth, I'm like, yeah, I don't think that's what an expert is. And we should have a debate about that. And if you're not willing to debate me because you have a different expert paradigm and you think you have direct access to the truth, honestly, I'm not sure there's anything I could say to you. Like, if you're already persuaded that you know what the truth is, then the whole fallibilism that undergirds my view is not going to be persuasive. If, on the other hand, you have another expert community that's coming to the table with a very different worldview, I think those are tremendous opportunities for engagement. And one example of how this has worked is the way in which climate scientists have begun to work with traditional indigenous communities in North America. Very different worldviews to start with, right? And needed to come to the table with mutual respect and the presumption that everyone had something really important to offer. And it's made the science better, right? Like the scientists have learned a lot from working with indigenous communities. And there have been relationships of trust that have built. So, if the alternative expert community is open to, and one of the reasons that it works is both communities come to the table with the idea that they both have a lot to offer and they both have a lot to learn from each other. And then it works. If you've already sort of decided, I don't have anything to learn from you, I don't see the point of engagement then.
Yeah, which makes sense, right? If you apply a hierarchy from the get-go, the person who's in the less powerful position is going to feel under threat. Yeah, I think that makes complete sense. Finton Parsons has a question, and Finton asks, what if experts have an over or under representation of values compared to the general public?
Right. So this is a problem that you worry about for democratic representation, and that's why I tend to not be consensus heavy. So suppose you have an underrepresentation of certain values in the expert community, but you still have a somewhat diverse community and it forms a robust consensus, but the values of the public, some members of the public, are not represented. Yeah, that's a problem. That's a problem, which is why I think it's always important for advice to, clue into what are the key values in the framing and the evidence sufficiency, because that will ameliorate a potential deficit in value representation in the expert community.
Oh, well, yeah, thank you. We are going to stay on for another few minutes with Heather to ask a few more questions. She's kindly given us some more of her time. So, and these are great questions that are coming in today. They really are absolutely fantastic. Julian Keimer has another great, actually two questions from Julian. Julian asks, if politicians accept the soundness of their scientific community by accepting their advice, does this also go the other way? What advice would you give to a conservative politician who wants to make evidence-informed policy in a country like the United States, where large parts of their electorate may not believe in the soundness of the scientific community? So we go with that one first.
Yeah, so great question. So part of this is going to have to be discussing broadly, and this is the ultimate science education worry, right? So like, if we raise citizens to believe that science is something that gives you, just knowledge that doesn't change. It's like a textbook. You open it and here's the knowledge, and look, it doesn't change. Then when experts change their minds, it's a problem and undermines sort of sensibility of trust. And I think a lot members of the public in the US have unfortunately come to that conclusion. They literally say things like, experts are always changing their mind. Therefore, they don't know what they're talking about. Therefore, I shouldn't trust them. That's a mistake. I'm not sure I can put all the weight on a politician to fix that. But it would help. Politicians are people who can be leaders, and a politician can say, look, I trust this piece of science advice because I know the scientists have been debating this issue and trying to figure out what to think about it in intensive ways for however long they've been working on it. That debate has been really robust, and I have been able to talk to them about that debate, and I have raised, for example, the kinds of issues that I know that you as members of the public have had with them, and they have had really good responses, and that's why I trust this advice. That's the kind of thing a politician could say and should say in the face of members of the public who are worried about trusting science advice in a particular case.
Yeah, Julian's very clever because he comes in, his second part really is very interesting. He says, might scientists be also disinclined to work with politicians who they fear will enact policies that are at odds with scientists' values, even if the politicians accept the evidence?
Yeah, so this is really difficult. This is why you need a good relationship between an individual science advisor, like a chief science advisor, and a politician, and why having some shared values is absolutely essential, because you need to trust that they will not do something that you would find abhorrent. Right? Otherwise, you're not going to want to work with them. Otherwise, you should find a different job than being their advisor. And I think that if you look at some of the situations that have happened in COVID-19, we can see science advisors who have done this really well and continue to try to. So like Anthony Fauci might have been like, I can't give advice to President Trump. He's not going to listen, but I'm going to keep this position because I'm going to speak to the American public in this position. And that's why he was one of the most trusted advisors. And he did not let Trump change what he was going to say. He embedded his advice in reliable evidence from the scientific community, but also embedded in the values that he made explicit. So I've heard him talk about things all the time. And he says, I care about saving human lives. I care about protecting human welfare in our communities. And this is the best way we have for doing that right now. Last year when we were all social distancing and masking, we still are, but it's coming, but it's going away. So, there are, and then there are science advisors who just, you see them cave to the political pressure to not upset. They don't want to upset their advisee. And so they just let the advisee get up and say whatever, and they don't challenge them. And those advisors are not meeting their obligations to the public. They are not helping the public understand what's going on better. So, science advisor position is a really hard position because this is a different talk. This is the talk for science advisors. You have obligations to the advisee, to the scientific community, and to the public. And you don't get to put one of those aside at any given time. All the time you have obligations to all three sets of things. And that's really difficult. So if you're going to be a science advisor, be prepared to feel drawn and quartered and to have the backbone to resist it.
So what can they do? So when you I suppose maybe it comes down to the strength of their institution or something, but how might somebody respond if they feel that the advisee is not relaying the expert advice that they've given? What options might they have open to them as a science advisor?
So I'll go back to the case of Richard Nixon when he said to Congress, oh, this advisory report said the SST is great, when it said the exact opposite. Mm-hmm. There was a huge, the guy, Richard Garwin was the lead author on the report, and he was furious. But at the time, science advice was not mandated to be public. So he let Congress know that, in fact, the advice said something different. Congress tried to get the report from Nixon. He claimed executive privilege. So Congress asked Garwin to come testify. Because the report was essentially confidential, Garwin reconstructed his advice on publicly available sources and presented that to Congress. Nixon was so mad, he fired his entire Presidential Science Advisory Committee. So you might lose your job, but it also got Congress to enact the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which then required all science advice to be made public, for science advisory committees to be balanced, for meetings to be made public, all these sorts of actions that really are crucial to protecting the democratic location and trustworthiness of science advice came about. So, you might have to go public. You might get fired. It's better than letting the politician, abuse science advice.
So,
I know that's like, so you might have to, but these scientists have, it's not like they'll never work again, or
for
they're
sure.
not being blacklisted, McCarthy era. It just means that you're not going to be the chief science advisor anymore.
Like if you were to visit us here in Dublin and you had the opportunity to talk to the minister with responsibility for science here, what characteristics of a good science advisor would you say needs to go on the job advert? In other words, what type of scientist are you looking for when you're hiring a chief science advisor?
Yeah, so they have to be someone who is a good scientist starting their career, but you need someone who is very aware of the limits of their own expertise and has a lot of connections in the scientific community so they can draw upon expertise as needed, right? Because the chances of them knowing everything, it's really small, right? So they're going to have to be able to have a network, and they have to be a person who's good at synthesizing a range of information, and of being open to being challenged by the experts they're drawing from, as well as by the politician. Someone who's a good communicator, and someone who shares roughly a lot of the same kind of social and ethical values, so that you're kind of in alignment, but is also going to be held to standards of intellectual integrity by the scientific community.
Yeah. Sounds good. I hope they do call on you to draw up this and perhaps put you on any interview panel. We go with our last question, which comes from Craig Slattery. And it kind of follows on what you're saying there in terms of the sense of not pretending to know it all. And I think in the last year, we've seen experts, in Ireland, we've seen experts from, say, areas like epidemiology or virology, becoming household names as they go on to sort of help to give a public face to some of the science that's coming through. And there's been some pushback from media, from the public, and from the science communities around people staying in their lane. But yet, I know from the other side, the media say we want a competent communicator to come on and be able to talk about the complexity in a way that the public will be able to understand. How do you square that, where you need a good communicator, somebody who's maybe a household name and might be trusted, but yet somebody who has the relevant expertise to speak about the issue?
Yeah, so honestly, I can't stand the language of staying in the lane, as if the lanes are clear. It seems more like you should be like, you want people to be aware of their sphere, but there always comes a like, so I'm super comfortable talking about values in science, blah, 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 all day, right? But then like I push out, it's like, suppose you want to ask me about like formal social epistemology modeling. I know something about that, but not, we're pushing to the I feel like I'm in the gray area. And what it's like to be a science advisor, I'm going to say, go talk to Sir Peter Gluckman, or, don't talk to me about that. I don't know about what it's actually like to be a person like this. So there's sort of a sense of a sphere, and you want someone who has like a clear sense of when they're like in the home territory, or when they're sort of pushing into the area that's murky for them, and who else they might want to call upon. And then the competent communicator is super tricky, right? Because you need someone who can get at issues in a pithy way, in a clear way, but doesn't like oversimplify in ways that are deceptive, right? Like it can't be just sort of simplified. It shouldn't be simplified for paternalistic reasons. That's a disaster. Right? Like, people find out about that, they're going to be pissed off, and rightly so. So that is an art. And I know people are trying to train people to get better at that. And I don't really have like, here's how to do that.
I think that, well, we shouldn't put you under pressure to come up with the magic. As Maria said, scientists are not magicians, and I guess philosophers are not too. So that's okay. But I guess that you know, that maybe a lot of science communicators, myself included, have felt comfortable going on and talking about things that, on the whole, unless we're talking about things like climate change, don't really have an immediate impact on the person's life today. So you can go on and talk about quantum physics, and there may be, like, you know, oblique references to how that person lives. And that's very different going on and talking about issues around a global pandemic, when people might have immediate concerns. And I suppose maybe at the end of all this, we'll learn an awful lot more about how science is being communicated and the role of science communicators and science advisors through this this current crisis. What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, it is easier to talk about science when it's just for the sake of wonder and like, wow, that's so cool, versus we have to do something, right? And the we includes the you that I'm talking to, and that makes a huge difference. And creates an additional set of burdens. That's exactly where the value considerations over saying too much, saying too little, that inductive risk about error gets really fraught. And that's precisely why I think we need to get more comfortable about talking about those values and flagging them in their place.
Yeah, I could talk about this with you all evening. It's been absolutely fascinating chatting to you about your work. And again, I'd recommend for people to do get the book. It's excellent. It's well worth the read. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, Heather. I hope to bring it into some of my teaching with student science teachers next year. So Heather, again, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. After Professor Douglas's talk today, we have Dan Sperber, and Dan will be talking as part of this lecture series on the 1st of June. And Dan's title is Trust versus Argument. So we look forward to that. As Maria mentioned, there are 2 additional lectures that, whilst not formally part of this lecture series, are also part of the broader PERITIA family. One by Mark Alfano on June 2nd, and the second one on June 15th by Christina Becchiari. And I'd encourage you to follow up on both of those if you've enjoyed the lecture series so far, and join us for Dan's talk, for Mark's, and for Christina. So it just leaves me now to thank Professor Heather Douglas again for her very thoughtful and very, very interesting talk, and to thank all of you for staying with us this afternoon, for your many, many questions. Apologies to those we didn't get to, and I hope you found it as enjoyable as I did. So thank you all very, very much.